come home. Around the year 2010, we witnessed an increase in the number of teens who were committing and trying and hurting themselves, succeeding at suicide. This was especially true for teens in the LGBTQ community who were trying to find their place and their way in a world that seemed not to be made for them, or not even to want them. During that time, two men who had survived bullying and being gay teens, surviving teenagehood is something itself, right? They had made it into adulthood and began a campaign called It Gets Better. They recorded their own stories of suffering, noting how the bullying of their teen years was not the last word about their lives. Instead, they were happy, successful, and struggling people, just like all of us. They uploaded their stories to a website and invited older LGBTQ adults, some of us were older then, their families and allies to record their own stories, noting that the suffering of the teen years was not the last word. Soon celebrities, politicians, family members, pastors, congregations, ordinary people began to record their own testimonies under the rubric of It Gets Better. I have found myself remembering those recordings and wishing we had something similar for the current moment. And perhaps we do in a very different way. Perhaps the rallies and the protests and people coming together and talking about events and suggestions and things that are happening in the world, people coming together around a vision of the world as it could be or even as it ought to be, is akin to the It Gets Better campaign. This yearning for a word beyond fear and helplessness, beyond despair, has led me back to the Psalms of Lament. Those texts in the Old Testament that are rich with human emotion, pleadings to God to hearken and listen, calling people to be honest with God about the journeys of our hearts and our souls. So how might the laments be a spiritual resource for those of us who identify as Christians in this moment and who want to remind ourselves that it gets better, maybe not in this moment, but this moment is not the last word. First of all, the laments are among the most honest of scriptures. They are as relevant in 2025 as they were in ancient times. Much like ancient people who experienced loss and grief, fear and anger, dislocation from one land to another, much like our ancestors of the faith, there is much to lament as people who have a vision for the world that does not seem to match the one that is being enacted at the moment. It is getting increasingly challenging for me to watch the news or read the headlines without my heart hurting. I suspect I'm not the only one. I find myself awash in grief as I realize what we are doing to the earth and to humans around the globe. I find myself captured by the laments of my heart. I lament the experience of people in Gaza where there is no food because of a lack of will to address the complexity of the issue. I lament the ongoing war in Ukraine and other parts of the world, but particularly the war in Ukraine and its attempt to kill a whole people into submission. I lament the harm that is occurring in our culture as hate and destruction become the norm, rather than the valuing of diversity or the building up of educational systems or affordable and accessible health care for all, or to find other ways to positively care for one another and for the world. I particularly lament what I see happening to visitors, strangers, and citizens in our neighborhoods, who find themselves taken away and placed in the most inhumane conditions in order to create fear among the rest of us. Many of these people are trying to survive, feed their kids, provide a hope for the future. They're farm workers and child care workers, elder care workers, health care, hospitality workers, chaplains and ministers who have advocated for justice for immigrants. All of these folks are ending up in inhumane places. I think of those whose skin is darker than most of ours and whose name may not sound like an American name. In fact, as I was reading some of the laments in preparation for this morning, I was reminded of Psalm 10. Listen to these words and see if they don't describe something we have seen in these weeks. They're the middle of the psalm where it talks about the complaint to God. There, meaning the wicked ones, their ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are high out of their sight. As for their foes, they scoff at them. They think in their heart, we shall not be moved. Throughout all generations, we shall not meet adversity. Their mouths are filled with cursing and deceit and oppression. Under their tongues are mischief and iniquity. They sit in ambush in the villages. In hiding places, they murder the innocent. Their eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. They lurk in secret like a lion in its covert. They lurk that they may seize the poor. They seize the poor and drag them off in their net. 2025, in some ways, is not a lot different than the ancient world. These collective laments for the community, the world, the earth, the inhabitants and creatures of the earth are compounded by our own personal laments. I have no doubt that many of us in this space carry the question of the psalmist in 13 when he says, "How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long will my tears be my food day and night?" as another psalmist says. In our families, among our friendship networks, the lives of those of us sitting in this pews, we know the trouble that tears at our souls. Whether it is facing a diagnosis that changes our life or a body that no longer works as it once did when it was 13 or 20 or even 40. We find ourselves perplexed. We try to understand why families can't seem to get along or kids can't do what they're supposed to do. Or try to tackle addictions or mental health concerns or facing the fear of a future loss of Medicaid or support systems or the lack of financial resources for food and shelter. Everyone has a point in which we shake our heads. We raise our hands and we wonder, where on earth is God? We are like those psalmists. The laments encourage us to name out loud those things that disturb us. Those things we lament, addressing God in our honesty and our grief and our fear. God appreciates, in fact, I think God yearns for our honesty. To have a deep relationship with God, one in which we know God and God knows us, not just individually, but as a community. We need honesty. Honest reflections, honest doubts, and honest courage to face another day. I trust that God cares enough to want to hear what is on our hearts. I think that God cares enough that we listen carefully to the voices of others and their laments, taking them seriously, and that we not negate the laments of our own lives. One thing is clear about the laments in the Holy Book. They do not hesitate to say what they think and feel. I encourage you during the week to pick up a Bible and look for some of those laments, Psalm 10 and Psalm 13 being a couple of them that are quite provocative, if you will. See how it what it looks like to be honest with God about one's anger, one's fear, and about asking God for support. Laments are not only expressions of pain or despair or suffering, they are also records of hope, born in our trust in God. The end of Psalm 13, I oftentimes look for what I call the holy but. But I trust. The end of lament. But I trust in the steadfastness of God because I have known God through the generations, the God that led people out of the desert. Laments almost always remind us that this moment is a moment and not the last word. It does get better. Do you hear the hope of a people who trust in God? Even if they are not considering or currently experiencing that wholeness in their life? I oftentimes say the laments invite us to lean into hope and trust when our logical mind says we ought to sit down and give up. Instead, the laments remind us that there is a God who has journeyed with us from time beginning. There is a God who journeyed with our ancestors, journeys with our neighbors, sits in the jail cells, sits in the hunger lines, sits homeless on the street or without shelter. There is a God from the beginning who is faithful to be steadfast with us. So how do we nurture that feeling of hope in the midst of our lament, in the midst of our suffering and our despair and our anger? I want to suggest 3 things real quickly. First of all, we are called to do work, and there is no denying that there is work to do in this moment, whether it's in our personal lives or our communal lives. There is work to do. Sometimes that means writing letters. Sometimes that means talking on the phone. Sometimes that means calling representatives. Sometimes that means holding a sign over the bridge of the highway. We are called to do something, and not all of us are called in the same way. Discern what is your gift to offer at the moment. Perhaps it's praying for those who have less. Perhaps it's showing up for a cause. But do what you are called to do, and then remember that along with being called to work, we're also being called to care for ourselves and for one another. We're called not just to work, but to take Sabbath and to rest. Walter Brueggemann was a teacher of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, as we would call it. He taught in several schools, including some that crossed my paths. He was famous for bringing the prophetic word of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, into the present day. He died just recently, and it gave me an occasion to reflect on his life once again in his writing. He reminded people that there are many ways to resist injustice, including taking Sabbath. This is what he said. Sabbath is not simply the pause that refreshes. It is the pause that transforms. In a world that rewards hustle and speed, silence and Sabbath, gathering with friends and neighbors on Sunday mornings, for example, walking in the woods, doing whatever it is that refreshes your soul is important in the work we have to do. Second, I want to encourage you to read the laments and to write your own. What is it that is troubling your soul? Who is this God in whom you believe? What are the characteristics of that God? Is it a merciful God of justice? Is it an angry God? Who is that God? What is the specific description or nature of the complaint you have? I once invited a Sunday school class I was working with to write their own laments and to bring them back the next week. One of the women in the class began the sharing by talking about how her son had been murdered by gun violence, and her lament was clear and unequivocal. Another talked about how they wished that the people that they saw on the streets holding signs needing food would find shelter and rest and safety. Another wished that the child that they had would grow up, whatever that meant, and be the child they hoped they would have. Whatever the lament is, it is okay to name it out loud, and I think God expects us to name it out loud. But you don't stop with the complaint. You also go on and you say, I do have this complaint. This is what's happening, and this is how I need you, God, in this moment. Could you show up in the family around you? Could you show up, God, in the person that I meet on the street? Could you show up in the face of the person that I most dislike in this moment? What is it you need from God? And then end with a reminder about why you even think God listens to you. What makes you think that God hears the tenderness of your soul and wants to respond? Look for your own kind of holy but I trust in God's unfailing grace because the Lord has been steadfast. Write your own lament and offer it to God or to one another. But the third thing is, today we participate in communion, which is a deeper reminder of God's steadfast presence over the generations. It is not that we have a magical God who reacts to every complaint we utter. My goodness, wouldn't that be something? A God of magic who responds every time I utter something? No, it is that we have a God who sits with us on that really rock bottom point. We have a God who sits with us when there's nothing else to do but to sit down. We have a God who walks with us when that journey seems lonely and we feel lost and scared. We don't know the directions. Communion is the reminder in some physical form that we have a God who offers to companion us on our journey. Communion is the living reminder that God intends wholeness and holiness for all of us, not just for some of us. That we are about the work of God in the world, not just the work in our own lives. The cup and bread provide for us the physical reminder that God loves us enough to help us find a way when there is no way that we can imagine. To help us find a way when we feel like there is no way. In many ways, communion is the It Gets Better campaign for the church. It is God's way of saying in a very visceral form that God's presence does not end with suffering and pain and sorrow. That is part of the journey, certainly. And God is steadfast in God's presence. There is something more in the vision of God's work in the world in this moment when suffering and despair seem so close at hand for so many of us. Communion invites us into a presence of a God who weeps with us, who holds us in the storms of life, who journeys with us, and who is steadfast to us. Thanks be to God for being that kind of a God. Amen.